The Duke of Ashgrove had not left his house in 4 years. He had closed the door the day he buried his wife. He had maintained her garden. He had pruned her roses. He had walked the ridge above the estate every morning at 6 o'clock, alone in all weather, because the ridge was the one place where the house and its memories were below him instead of around him. He was not looking for anyone. He had told himself and his sister and the empty rooms of Ashgrove House that the space Marguerite had occupied was shaped exactly to her dimensions, and no other woman would fit it. Looking for someone new was not just disloyal, it was geometrically impossible. And then, on a Tuesday morning in March, a woman came out of the fog. She was walking fast, arms swinging, chin up, moving like a woman who had been told she was not beautiful and had decided that movement was a better use of her body than display. She nearly walked into him. She stopped. She looked at him without flinching, without deferring, without the adjustment people made when they knew he was a duke. She did not know he was a duke. She saw a man on a path, nothing more. He did not know her name. He did not know that every morning, in a spotted mirror in a boarding house 3 miles away, she said 3 sentences to herself like a prayer in reverse. I'm too old. I'm too plain. I'm not her. He would hear those words once, and when he did, he would say the only word that mattered. Welcome to Duke of Hearts romance. Tonight's story is about a woman whose worst enemy lives in a spotted mirror and speaks in her own voice, and about a man who closed his door 4 years ago and forgot how to open it. They walked the same ridge for 3 years without meeting. Then the fog brought them together. And what happened next will either break you or put you back together. Probably both. Before we begin, where are you listening from tonight? What city, what country, what time? Drop it in the comments. Whether you are in bed, on a drive, or sitting in a quiet room after everyone else has gone to sleep, you are not alone. We are all here. Let me take you there. But first, I need to take you back, because the woman in the fog did not arrive on that ridge already broken. She was built that way, year by year, mirror by mirror, by a life that kept asking her to measure herself against women she could never be. Her name was Judith Vane. She was 37 years old, and she had spent the last 11 years of her life being the other woman in a house that belonged to a ghost. She was born in a narrow house above an apothecary's shop in Taunton, Somerset, the second daughter, the plain one. The one who climbed higher than any boy in the county and broke her nose falling out of an apple tree at 12, and who spent the next 25 years being told in 100 different ways by 100 different rooms that a broken nose was the least of what was wrong with her. Her father, Arthur Vane, was a solicitor. Comfortable family. Not wealthy. Solicitors in market towns occupied the solid, unspectacular middle of English professional life. They owned their house. They employed a cook and a maid. They sent both daughters to a ladies' academy in Bath, where the girls learned French, embroidery, watercolors, and the piano, which was the standard curriculum for producing women who could decorate a drawing room without disturbing it. Judith's older sister, Constance, was the one the curriculum was designed for, golden-haired, fine-featured, with the easy, reflexive prettiness that made rooms rearrange themselves around her. Constance married at 20, a clergyman with a good living in Devon, and produced 2 daughters in the first 3 years, then nothing for a decade, then Thomas, who arrived when Constance was 35, and who she referred to, with the rueful affection of a woman who had thought the nursery was closed, as her postscript. She was happy in the uncomplicated way that women who fit the shape the world prepared for them are happy. This is not a criticism. Constance was kind. She simply never had to discover what she was made of because she was never tested. Judith was tested. She was not pretty. She knew this early, and she knew it precisely, because Judith Vane had the curse of an analytical mind inside an ordinary body, and the mind would not stop analyzing. Her face was long, with a square jaw and a nose that had been broken at 12 when she fell from an apple tree and had healed with a slight crook to the left. Her skin was freckled, not the decorative scattering across the nose that novels describe, but the dense, thorough freckling of a woman with fair skin and too little interest in bonnets. Her hair was brown. Not chestnut, not auburn, not any of the warmer words. Brown. The brown of a sparrow's wing, straight, fine, refusing to hold a curl regardless of how many rags she slept in. Her eyes were the only thing anyone had ever called remarkable. They were green, not the vivid emerald of romance novels, but a quiet, mossy green that shifted toward gray in winter light and toward something warmer in summer. Her mother had said they were her best feature. Judith had calculated that one good feature out of 20 was a ratio that did not survive market conditions. She was 5'6", neither tall enough to be striking nor short enough to be delicate. She was built straight, no particular curve at the hip, no particular fullness at the chest, the body of a woman who had been told since adolescence that she was built for walking, not for looking at, and who had eventually agreed. At 25, her father died. Debts emerged, not catastrophic but sufficient. The house was sold. Her mother moved to Devon to live with Constance. Judith needed to work. In 1836, the options for an unmarried gentlewoman who needed income were 3: governess, companion, or marriage. Marriage required a suitor. Judith had no suitors. A companion required a patron. Judith had no patrons. A governess required references and a tolerance for being treated as furniture with opinions. Judith had both. She became a governess. She was good at it. Better than good. She could teach French, arithmetic, music, history, and the quiet, undramatic skill of thinking clearly under pressure, which was not in the curriculum, but was the most useful thing she gave any child she taught. What no one told her, what no one told any woman who entered this profession, was that the governess position was a door that locked behind you. A governess was the only respectable employment available to a gentlewoman without means, but taking it marked you. You were no longer family, you were no longer servant. You occupied a social corridor between the two, too educated for the kitchen, too employed for the drawing room. The families who hired you did not introduce you to their guests. The men who might have married you before you worked would not marry you after. The system offered one option and then punished every woman who took it by making her permanently ineligible for the life the option was supposed to preserve. Judith understood this within her first year. She took the position anyway because the alternative was destitution, and Judith Vane was not a woman who chose the dignified version of starving over the undignified version of surviving. At 26, she was hired by Sir Edward Holt of Hartfield Park, Somerset, a widower with one daughter, Caroline, aged 4. Sir Edward was 35 when she arrived, a tall, thin man with sandy hair going prematurely sparse at the crown, a long face that would have been handsome if it had not been so permanently tired, and the stooped posture of someone carrying an invisible weight across his shoulders. He had a habit of holding his reading glasses in one hand and gesturing with them while he spoke, as though the glasses were making the points his voice was too quiet to make. The position was live-in. The salary was £25 per year. The house was large, the child was difficult, and the ghost of Sir Edward's dead wife, Eleanor, was in every room. Eleanor Holt had died of a hemorrhage after a second pregnancy that did not survive. The baby was buried with her. Caroline was 2. Sir Edward was 31, and destroyed the way men are when the woman who made their world livable leaves it without warning. Eleanor had been genuinely good. Not Saint Good, not the sanitized goodness that people project onto the dead. She was warm, practical, funny, impatient with stupidity, generous with her time, and possessed of the kind of beauty that did not diminish other women but simply existed alongside them, the way sunlight exists alongside lamplight without making the lamp feel small. She had auburn hair. Judith knew this because the portrait hung in the drawing-room, a full-length oil, commissioned the year before Eleanor's death, showing a woman of 28 in a blue dress with auburn hair falling over one shoulder and brown eyes that held the specific warmth of someone who is about to laugh at something the painter just said. The portrait was beautiful. The woman in it was beautiful. And Judith stood in front of it on her first day at Hartfield Park and understood with cold clarity what she was living inside. A memorial. The house was Eleanor's. Not legally. Legally, it was Sir Edward's, and after his death it would pass to Caroline. But spiritually, architecturally, in every way that mattered to the people who lived in it, the house belonged to the dead woman. Her curtains, her furniture arrangement, her china pattern, her preferred flowers in the hallway, lilies, always lilies, because Eleanor had loved lilies, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Partridge, had maintained the standing order with the florist for 4 years after Eleanor's death. The house smelled like lilies, every room, every morning, the scent of a woman who was gone and who was, somehow, more present than anyone alive. Judith lived in this house for 11 years. She raised Caroline from 4 to 15. She taught her to read, to think, to argue, to calculate, to sit with discomfort instead of fleeing from it. She nursed Caroline through measles at 6 and a broken arm at 9 and the savage grief of a 13-year-old girl who suddenly understood, with the full force of adolescent feeling, that her mother was never coming back. During the measles, Judith slept on the floor beside Caroline's bed for 8 nights. She did not tell Sir Edward. She did not tell Mrs. Partridge. She simply moved a blanket to the floor and stayed because the child was frightened and the child's mother could not come and someone had to be there, and Judith was someone. She managed the household accounts after Sir Edward's health declined, a slow weakening of the lungs that began in his 40s and progressed with the patient, indifferent cruelty of a disease that takes its time. She corrected the land agent's arithmetic. She negotiated with the butcher when the meat bills climbed. She kept the house running, invisibly, reliably. Nobody on deck ever thought to look below and see who was shoveling the coal. Sir Edward noticed. He was not a cruel man, not an oblivious man. He saw what Judith did. He thanked her. He raised her salary twice, to £30, then 35. He told Caroline more than once that Miss Vane was the best thing that had happened to this household since your mother. Since your mother. The qualifier that followed Judith through every room. The invisible footnote on every compliment. You are wonderful, but you are second. You are essential, but you are not Eleanor. You are the best thing since, and since is a word that means after, which means less. Judith heard it every time. She filed it precisely, without visible reaction, in the part of her mind that processed data too painful for the part that processed feeling. She also loved him. This is the part she never said and never showed and never allowed to become anything but a fact she carried in silence, privately, accurately, without expecting anyone to notice. She loved Sir Edward Holt. She loved his kindness and his grief and his distracted, slightly baffled way of moving through a house he no longer understood. She loved the way he read to Caroline in the evenings, doing all the voices badly. She loved the way he stood in front of Eleanor's portrait sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, with his hand raised as though he were about to touch the painted face, and then dropping it because the distance between paint and skin was the distance between having and having lost. She loved him, and she said nothing, because the math was simple. He loved Eleanor. Eleanor was beautiful. Judith was not. Eleanor. The equation did not balance, and never would. She said it to herself in the mirror every morning. I'm too old. I'm too plain. I'm not her. It began as an observation. It hardened into a ritual. The ritual became a wall, and the wall became the shape of her life. Sir Edward died when Judith was 34. Lungs. The disease had been patient, and it was finished being patient. He died in November, in the bedroom he had shared with Eleanor, with Caroline holding one hand and Judith holding the other, and his last words were, "Tell Caroline I'm going to see her mother." Her mother, not the woman holding his left hand, the woman who had been dead for 13 years. Judith held his hand and heard this, and she did not let go, and she did not cry, and she pressed his fingers between both of hers until the warmth left them, and then she stood, and she straightened the blanket, and she walked downstairs to tell Mrs. Partridge to send for the undertaker. She cried later, alone, in the small room at the top of the house that had been hers for 11 years. She cried for the man she had loved and for the woman he had loved instead, and for the fact that the word since your mother, since Eleanor, since the one who mattered, was now the word that defined her entirely. She had been the woman after, for 11 years, and now the after was over and she was nothing. Caroline was 15 when her father died. The estate passed to a male cousin, a distant Holt from Wiltshire, pleasant, ineffectual, who arrived with a wife and plans to redecorate. Judith was given a reference, a month's notice, and £30 in lieu of the quarter's salary. She packed her trunk. She said goodbye to Caroline, who cried, genuinely, without performance, the tears of a girl who was losing the second mother she had not known she had. Judith held her and said, "You will be fine. You are the strongest person I have ever taught." She did not say, "I love you." She did not say, "I have loved you since you were 4 and frightened, and I slept on the floor beside your bed." She did not say these things because saying them would have required acknowledging that the 11 years had been more than employment, and acknowledging that would have broken the scaffolding that was holding her upright. She moved to Mrs. Beale's boarding house in Langford, 3 miles from Hartfield Park. Mrs. Beale was 63, short, wide through the hips. With white hair she wore in a braid around her head like a crown she had given herself. She had a round, pink face, flour on her apron at all hours, and the particular gift of a woman who could see everything happening in her house and choose, with surgical precision, which things to mention and which to let pass. She let most things pass, close enough to see the chimneys from the hill above the town, far enough that she would not be seen looking. She found work, not as a governess. At 34 she was, past the age most families wanted. The market for governesses was young, presentable, decorative. Judith was none of these things. She was experienced, competent, and 34, and the market had no column for that. She took in mending. She kept accounts for the grocer and the draper, a few shillings a week, enough to pay Mrs. Beale and eat and buy candles. She read in the evenings. She walked the hills above Langford in the mornings, because walking was free, and because the Somerset hills in early light were the one beautiful thing she could have without asking anyone's permission. And every morning she stood in front of the mirror. It hung above the washstand in her rented room at the top of Mrs. Beale's house, a small square of glass, spotted with age, the silver backing wearing thin in one corner, so her reflection had a hole in it where her left shoulder should have been. She stood in front of it at 6 o'clock, while the house was still dark, and the only sound was the baker's cart on the cobbles below. "I'm too old. I'm too plain. I'm not her." 3 sentences, spoken quietly, without drama. A morning prayer in reverse, not asking for something, but confirming the absence of it. 3 years. The words wore a groove in her, a footpath beaten smooth by daily use, the grass giving up, the bare earth showing through. She was 37. She was alone. And the voice in the mirror had become so familiar that she no longer heard it as cruelty. She heard it as fact. 5 miles from Langford, on the other side of the ridge that divided the Quantock Hills, stood Ashgrove House, a duke's estate. 6,000 acres of Somerset parkland, farmland, and woodland, anchored by a Palladian house that had been built in 1740 and that looked, from the ridge on a clear morning, like something a wealthy man had dropped into the landscape and forgotten to collect. Henry Calder, the 6th Duke of Ashgrove, had not forgotten. He was there every day. He had been there every day for 4 years, since the day he came home from London and closed the door and did not leave again. Society called this grief. Society was half right. Henry was 44. He had the kind of face that had been handsome at 25 and was now something else. Lived in, weathered, with lines around the eyes that deepened when he was thinking, which was most of the time, and a jaw that had gone from sharp to heavy in the way that men's jaws do when they stop caring whether anyone is looking at them. His hair was black. Genuinely black, not dark brown, romanticized as black, but the actual blue-black of a crow's wing, going white at the left temple in a single streak that had appeared the week after his wife died, and that his valet had offered to dye, and that Henry had declined because vanity required energy, and energy was a resource he had reallocated. His eyes were green, a darker green than Judith's, the green of deep water in shade, the green that women, at London, balls had called mesmerizing, and that Henry had found embarrassing, because being mesmerizing required a performance he was unwilling to give. He was 6 feet tall, built solid, not the lean elegance of a horseman, but the settled weight of a man who dug his own garden and carried his own wood. His clothes hung loose and slightly creased. Dressing was a concession to civilization, not a contribution to it. He had large hands, square, capable, with a callus on the right thumb from the pruning shears he used in the walled garden, which was the one place at Ashgrove where he did physical work and the one place where his body felt like it belonged to him rather than to the title. He had been in love with his wife Marguerite for 20 years. They married when he was 22, and she was 19. She was French. Her family were minor Normandy gentry who had survived the Revolution by being too unimportant to guillotine and too stubborn to emigrate. She had dark hair and a quick laugh, and a directness that the English found either charming or rude, depending on how threatened they felt by a woman who said what she thought. The fact that she was French gave the rude camp additional ammunition. England in the 1840s was only a generation removed from Waterloo, and the national suspicion of the French had softened but not disappeared. A French duchess was tolerated the way a brilliant eccentricity is tolerated, admired in private, questioned in public. Henry had found it neither charming nor rude. He had found it essential. Marguerite said what she thought. Henry, who had been raised in a household where feelings were managed like servants, kept in their quarters, brought out when needed, dismissed when inconvenient, married a woman who left every feeling in the middle of the room where anyone could trip over it. They were happy, not the uncomplicated happiness of people who have never been tested. The argued, rebuilt, recalibrated happiness of 2 people who were different enough to generate friction and honest enough to use the friction instead of avoiding it. One evening, this would have been their 3rd year, a Tuesday in November, Henry remembered the day of the week because it was the night the chimney smoked. They were eating dinner in the small dining room. Marguerite was explaining, with increasing volume and a bread roll she was using as a prop, why the Corn Laws were destroying English agriculture and why Henry's fellow peers in the Lords were complicit idiots. Henry was trying to eat his soup. "You are not listening," she said. "I am listening. You said the tariff on imported grain is artificially inflating domestic prices to benefit landowners at the expense of— May I have my fork back?" She had taken his fork to illustrate a point about trade routes. She was holding it like a conductor's baton. "When I have finished." "The soup is getting cold." "The soup can wait." "The poor cannot." Henry looked at this woman, dark-haired, flushed, holding his fork hostage over trade policy, her boots still muddy from the garden because she had come to dinner directly from pruning and had not bothered to change. And he thought, "I would sit through every political argument in England to keep her at this table. I would eat cold soup for the rest of my life." He did not say this. He ate the cold soup. She kept the fork. The chimney smoked. The Corn Laws were not repealed for another 2 years, and when they were, Marguerite wrote to 3 members of Parliament to tell them they were late. They did not have children. Not from choice, from biology. The specific biology was never identified because the medical profession of the 1830s and 1840s did not possess the tools to identify it, and the social profession of the same period did not possess the willingness to look anywhere except the wife. Marguerite was examined, Marguerite was treated, Marguerite was told to rest, to exercise, to take the waters at Bath, to eat liver, to avoid liver, to pray. Henry was not examined. Henry was not treated. Henry was not told anything, because the possibility that a duke's body might be the reason for a duchess's empty nursery was not a thought the world was prepared to think. Marguerite handled this with the directness Henry loved her for. "Either it will happen or it will not," she said on a January evening in their 7th year of marriage, sitting in the walled garden at Ashgrove with her boots muddy and her dark hair coming loose. "And if it does not, we will be 2 people who love each other instead of 2 people who love each other and also have children. The mathematics still balance." Henry had loved her for that sentence for 13 years after she said it. She had said it, he later understood, against the full weight of a social machinery that was designed to make it unsayable. A duke without an heir was not a private sorrow. It was a public emergency. The title, the estates, the seat in the Lords, the political alliances that depended on succession, all of it required a son. Society had opinions about childless duchesses. Society expressed those opinions at dinner tables and in drawing rooms, and through the particular cruelty of women who mentioned their own children in Marguerite's presence with exaggerated casualness, as though fertility were an achievement they had earned rather than a circumstance that had happened to them. The pressure came from every direction: his family, her doctors, their friends, the unspoken expectation that hung over every social event like smoke. And Marguerite sat in her garden with muddy boots and said, "The mathematics still balance." She said it as an act of war against an entire system, and Henry had loved her for the war as much as the words. Marguerite died 4 years before this story's present. Typhus. A London visit. They had attended a parliamentary debate because Marguerite was interested in the Corn Laws, and because Henry voted in the Lords, and because she refused to let him vote without her opinion ringing in his ears during the division. The disease came from the water, or the air, or the particular filth of a city that housed 2 million people and had not yet learned that sewage and drinking water should not share the same river. She was dead within 10 days. The disease did not care about the Corn Laws. Henry brought her home to Ashgrove. He buried her in the churchyard beside the walled garden she had loved. He placed a stone that said, Marguerite Calder, 1819 to 1845, who said what she thought. And then he went inside the house and closed the door. 4 years. He managed the estate by correspondence, attended the Lords by proxy, and saw no one except his steward, his solicitor, and his sister. He walked the walled garden every morning, pruning Marguerite's roses, maintaining the beds she had designed, keeping alive the one piece of the world she had touched that he could still tend. He told himself, and his sister, and the empty rooms, that no one could be Marguerite, that the space she had occupied was shaped exactly to her dimensions, and no other woman would fit it. That looking for someone new was geometrically impossible, like trying to hang a round painting in a square frame. Lady Fenton, who had the family's green eyes, a sharp chin she pointed at people when she disagreed with them, and none of the family's patience, told him he was a fool. You are not honoring Marguerite by refusing to live. You are honoring your own comfort. Grief is hard, living is harder, and you, Henry, have chosen the easier of the two and dressed it up as devotion. Henry had no answer for this, because his sister was right, and he knew it, and knowing it changed nothing. Judith did not know the Duke of Ashgrove existed. This is not a figure of speech. She literally did not know there was a duke living 5 miles from her boarding house. She knew Ashgrove House. She could see it from the ridge on her morning walks, a pale shape in the valley, surrounded by parkland. She assumed it belonged to a family she would never meet, in the way that large houses belong to people who exist in a different version of England from the one she inhabited. She walked the ridge every morning, 6 o'clock, before Mrs. Beale's other boarders were awake. The path ran along the top of the Quantocks for 2 miles, through gorse and heather, with the Bristol Channel visible on clear days and the Somerset levels stretching south. She walked in all weather, rain, fog, frost, the sideways wind that came off the hills in winter and hit you like a door. She walked because it was the 1 hour of the day when she did not have to be anything for anyone. Not a governess, not an account-keeper, not a lodger, not a spinster, just a body moving through space, legs working, lungs filling. The unremarkable body doing the one thing it was good at, carrying her forward. Henry Calder also walked the ridge. He had been walking it for 4 years, the same path, the same time, the same direction. He walked from the Ashgrove side, through the gate in the estate wall, up the sheep track to the ridge, and along the top for 2 miles before turning back. He walked because the walled garden was Marguerite's, and the ridge was his, the one space where the house and its memories were below him instead of around him. They had been walking the same ridge at the same time for 3 years without meeting. The path was wide enough, the weather variable enough, the timing imprecise enough that 2 people walking from opposite ends could pass without intersection for months. Judith walked east, Henry walked west. The ridge held both of them without introducing them. Until the Tuesday in March I already told you about. The fog, the collision, the woman who came out of the gray like a ship and nearly walked into him. But I told you that from above. Let me tell you what it felt like from inside. The fog was thick, the particular Somerset fog that rises from the levels and fills the valleys and then climbs the hills and sits on the ridge like a ceiling lowered to 5 feet. You could see the ground. You could not see 10 yards ahead. Walking in it was like walking inside a cloud that had given up on altitude. Judith was walking fast. She always walked fast, not from urgency, but from the habit of a woman who had spent 11 years moving quickly through a house where being slow meant being noticed, and being noticed meant being compared. Henry was walking slowly. He always walked slowly on the ridge, It was the one place he was not in a hurry, because there was nothing at either end he was hurrying toward. She came out of the fog and stopped. He stopped. The fog pressed in around them. "Sorry," she said. "I didn't see you." "The fog," he said. "Yes, the fog." They stood on the path. She was breathing hard from the pace. He was not. She looked at him. A tall man in a dark coat, black hair with a white streak at the temple, green eyes, large hands, slightly rumpled. He looked like a man who had been walking for a long time and had forgotten he was doing it. She assessed him directly, analytically, without the softening that women were expected to apply to the act of looking at a man. She filed what she saw. She moved on. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning." She stepped around him and continued walking. He stood on the path and watched her disappear into the fog. The straight back, the swinging arms, the brown hair knotted at the nape and already losing its battle with the wind. He stood in the fog for a full minute after she disappeared, trying to identify what had just happened. He resumed walking. He thought about the green of her eyes, which was not unlike his own. He thought about the freckles. He thought about the broken nose, which should have been a flaw and was instead the most interesting feature on her face, because it was the one thing that wasn't trying to be anything other than what it was. Marguerite was absent from his thoughts. For the first time in 4 years, he walked a mile without her in it, and he only noticed the absence until he was home, and when he noticed it, he sat in the walled garden and felt guilty and relieved and confused in equal measure. They met again the following Tuesday. Same fog, same path, same near collision. "You again," she said. "The fog again," he said. "You could walk at a different time." "So could you." A pause. The fog moved around them. A sheep coughed somewhere below the ridge, the wet, existential cough of an animal that has been standing in damp grass and is questioning its life choices. "I walk at 6 because the house is quiet," she said. "I take it you walk at 6 because something in your house is loud." "Not loud. Present." Her gaze held him. The eyes, moss green in the fog light, took in the word present and the weight behind it. She let the word sit without asking what it held. She was a woman who had lived in a house full of a dead woman's presence for 11 years. She recognized the shape of the sentence. "Tuesday, then," she said. "Apparently." "Apparently." She walked on. He walked on. The sheep coughed again. The fog held its position. The following Tuesday the fog was gone. The morning was clear. A March morning that Somerset produces when it has exhausted its supply of gray and allows, reluctantly, a single perfect day. The ridge was bright. The channel glittered. The levels stretched south in panels of green and silver. Judith was sitting on the stone wall at the halfway point, drinking water from a bottle she carried in her coat pocket. She had not expected to see him. Fog was their medium. Clarity was not. But he appeared on the path from the Ashgrove direction, walking slowly, hands in his pockets, his black hair catching the sun. He saw her. He altered course toward the wall. "No fog," he said. "No fog. You're sitting." "I'm resting. There is a difference." "Is there? Resting is deliberate. Sitting is what happens when your legs make the decision." He almost smiled. His face was not practiced at it. The muscles attempted the shape without fully committing, the rusty mechanics of an expression that hadn't been used in years. It didn't quite arrive, but it was visible. He sat on the wall beside her, not close, 3 feet of stone between them. "You walk fast," he said. "You walk slowly." "I have nowhere to go." "Neither do I. I just get there faster." This time the smile arrived, brief, surprised, as though it had escaped from a room he thought he'd locked. They sat on the wall. She drank her water. He looked at the view. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had spent years in the company of absence and who understood that sometimes the most honest thing two people can do is sit beside each other and say nothing. "I don't know your name," he said eventually. "Judith. Judith Vane. Henry. Just Henry? For now." She took in the coat, from the boots, from the quality of the cloth, even rumpled, that he was not a farmer or a tradesman. She suspected he was connected to Ashgrove House, but left it alone. Asking would introduce the world of names and titles and the social machinery that arranged people into categories, and on this ridge, in this light, she did not want to be categorized. "Henry," she said, "you have a white streak in your hair." "I'm aware." It appeared suddenly. He opened his mouth, closed it. He had been about to say something light, something about the streak being a family tradition or a disagreement with a barber. But what came out instead was the truth, because Judith Vane had the quality of making deflection feel like more effort than honesty. "4 years ago, after my wife died." "I'm sorry. Thank you." "Was she—" Judith stopped, started again. "Was she good?" The question was unusual. Not, was she beautiful, or was she young, or how did she die? Was she good? As though goodness were the relevant measurement, and everything else was noise. "She was the best person I have ever known," Henry said. Judith nodded. She looked at the channel. She had already said sorry, and repetition would dilute it. She would not say, "I understand," because claiming to understand someone else's grief was a theft she would not commit. "I lived in a house with a portrait of a woman like that," she said, "for 11 years. I never met her. I knew everything about her. And every morning I looked in the mirror and measured myself against her, and the measurement never balanced." She said this without bitterness, without self-pity. She said it plainly. As a fact, she lived inside, like a house with a low ceiling. You learn to duck. You stop noticing you're ducking. The ducking becomes your posture. Henry looked at her. At the face he was beginning to learn. The jaw, the eyes that held intelligence and resignation in equal measure. He looked at a woman who had just described his exact condition from the other side. He was the person maintaining the memorial. She was the person who had lived inside one. And the recognition hit him like a hand against his chest. "What was her name?" he asked. "The woman in the portrait." "Eleanor?" "And you measured yourself against Eleanor every morning." "Every morning, too old, too plain. Not her." "You say this." "I say it to a mirror with a hole in the silver. It's a morning ritual. Some people pray. I inventory my deficiencies." "That is not the same as prayer." "It functions identically. A daily recitation of something you believe without evidence, repeated until the repetition feels like truth." This direct, self-demolishing woman who compared devotional practice to self-destruction with the casual precision of someone who had thought about both and found them structurally similar, and felt something shift inside his chest. Not a door opening, something closer to a hinge, remembering it could move. They sat on the wall until the sun climbed high enough to warm the stone. Then Judith stood, because she had mending to collect from Mrs. Ashby, and accounts to do for the draper, and the morning could not last forever, even when she wanted it to. "Tuesday," she said. "Tuesday." She left first. She was already 10 yards ahead. She'd gone 10 yards. He sat on the wall a few minutes longer, not because he was thinking anything profound, but because his left boot had developed a crease that was pressing on his toe, and he needed to adjust it. He adjusted it. He walked home. The crease came back halfway down the hill. The Tuesdays became the architecture of Judith's week. Not its purpose. She would not allow herself that. Its punctuation. The comma in the middle of 7 days of mending and accounts, and Mrs. Beale's watery soup, and the mirror every morning, and the 3 sentences that had worn their groove so deep she could feel the edges of it in her sleep. They talked. On the wall, in all weather, for an hour each Tuesday. Judith learned that Henry managed land. A lot of land, she gathered, from the way he discussed drainage and crop rotation and tenant cottages with the detailed knowledge of a man who walked his own fields. The title stayed hidden. He kept it from her, not from deception, but from preservation. On the ridge, he was Henry. Henry was the version of himself that existed before the title and after the grief, the version that could sit on a stone wall and talk to a woman who had no idea she was supposed to be impressed. Henry learned that Judith had been a governess, that she kept accounts for half the shops in Langford, that she had raised a girl for 11 years and loved her and lost her and had not said so. He learned this last part not from what she said, but from how she didn't say it. The tightness in her voice when she mentioned Caroline, the way her hands went still in her lap, the breath she took before moving past the name. He watched her. Not with the consuming attention he had given Marguerite. Something quieter. The attention you give a landscape you are beginning to understand. The way her hands moved when she talked, quick, precise, the hands of a woman who had spent years doing things rather than describing them, how she pushed her hair behind her ear with her thumb, an impatient gesture, as though her hair were an interruption she didn't have time for. The way she walked. He watched her walk, away from him, toward him, along the ridge, arms swinging, chin up. She walked like a woman who had been told she was not beautiful and had decided that movement was a better use of her body than display. He watched her laugh. It happened rarely. Judith. Vane was not a woman who laughed easily, but when it came, the laugh changed her face. The jaw softened. The crooked nose looked less like a flaw and more like punctuation, the mark that made the rest of her face readable. The green eyes narrowed and warmed. She laughed the way some people sing, badly, fully, without caring about the sound. He watched these things, and he felt the sealed part of himself shift, not opening, expanding, making space for what it had not been designed to hold. Tuesdays and Thursdays, the wall on the ridge, the view south to the levels and north to the channel. 2 people sitting apart on the wall, talking about everything except the thing that was growing between them. On a Tuesday in April, Judith brought an apple. She had not planned to share it. She had planned to eat it herself on the walk home. But Henry arrived without breakfast, which she determined from the fact that he was looking at the apple with the undisguised focus of a man whose stomach was making decisions his manners were trying to overrule. "Have you eaten?" she said. "I was pruning. I forgot." "You forgot to eat. The roses needed deadheading. The roses do not wait for breakfast." She broke the apple in half with her hands, a clean break, the sound of it sharp in the morning air, and held out the larger piece. He took it. They sat on the wall eating apple halves and watching the kestrel and saying nothing, and the nothing was comfortable, and the apple was a Cox's orange pippin that Mrs. Beale had bought from the market, and that Judith had taken from the kitchen without asking, which was technically theft, but which Judith had decided was justified by the severity of the crease in Henry's brow. "Your roses," she said. "Which ones?" "The climbers on the south wall. Marguerite planted them. And you deadhead them every April, every July, every October." "That is a lot of deadheading." "That is a lot of roses." The sheep from the first Tuesday, or a sheep anyway, it was impossible to tell from the ridge, coughed in the field below them. The same wet, existential cough. Judith had begun to think of it as the sheep's commentary on the human condition. The sheep probably had a cold, but the cough was well timed. "I killed the wisteria," Henry said. "Which wisteria?" "The one on the east wall. Marguerite's. Well, she planted it the year we married. I've been maintaining it for 22 years. Last month I pruned it too hard. Cut into the old wood. It hasn't recovered." He said this with the quiet devastation of a man who has destroyed a living thing he was supposed to be protecting. Not the roses, not the important ones, the wisteria, a plant that had survived 2 decades of English weather and was killed by the person responsible for its care. "You feel guilty?" Judith said. "I feel like a man who murdered a plant his dead wife loved." "You pruned it incorrectly. That's horticulture, not homicide." "The wisteria would disagree. The wisteria is dead. It has no opinions." Henry looked at her, and he laughed, the real laugh, the one that arrived unplanned and startled them both. It was the second time she'd heard it. She was keeping count, though she would not have admitted this. They talked about books. Judith had read widely and remembered everything. Henry had read selectively and thought deeply. Their conversations about novels were arguments, proper arguments, with evidence and counter-evidence, and the energy of 2 minds that sharpened each other by disagreeing. They talked about the kestrel that hunted the ridge every morning, and whether it was the same kestrel or a succession of kestrels, and Judith said, "Does it matter? The hunting is the same." And Henry thought about that sentence for 3 days. On a Thursday in May, Henry attempted a joke about the sheep. Something about its cough, sounding like his steward reviewing the accounts. It was not funny. Judith looked at him with the expression of a woman who has been given something she was not expecting and is trying to decide where to put it. The silence after lasted 4 seconds, which is a long time when you are sitting on a wall with someone whose opinion you have begun to care about. "That was not your best," she said. "No." "Was it intended to be humorous?" "It was. I am out of practice." "Evidently." He did not attempt a joke again for 3 weeks, and when he did, it was marginally better, and Judith's mouth twitched, which he counted as a victory. They did not talk about Eleanor. They did not talk about Marguerite. The ghosts were present. You could feel them in the gap of stone between, but neither named them, because naming them would require naming what the Tuesdays and Thursdays had become, and naming it was a step neither was ready for. But Henry had begun to notice things. On a Thursday in late April, Judith arrived at the wall 7 minutes late. She sat down without speaking. Her hands were pressed flat against her thighs, a gesture he had not seen before but that he recognized instantly, because it was the gesture of someone holding something down. She said nothing for the first 3 minutes. Then she said, "The draper's accounts are wrong again," and the conversation resumed, and whatever had been pressing against her palms retreated behind the ordinary. Henry noticed. He filed it the way Judith would have filed it, precisely without comment. He did not ask. But the image stayed, her hands, flat, pressed, holding, and then he saw what he was not supposed to see, and it changed everything. It was a Tuesday in May. Henry arrived early, 15 minutes before their usual time. The ridge was empty. He sat on the wall and waited. She appeared from the eastern path. But he was hidden from her. A bend in the path, and a stand of gorse concealed the wall from the approach. She was walking, but not with her usual stride. She was slower. Her arms were not swinging. Her head was down. She stopped on the path, 20 yards from where he sat, hidden by the gorse. She stood still. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs, the gesture she made when something inside her needed holding down. And then, quietly, in the morning air, she said it. "I'm too old," I'm too plain. I'm not her. She said it. The same words, the same flat tone, the same morning. To no one, to herself. A recitation, a daily confirmation of a verdict she had accepted so long ago that challenging it would require dismantling the entire structure of who she believed she was. Henry heard it, every word. He was close enough to hear the flatness of it, the absence of emotion, which was worse than emotion, because it meant the words had stopped hurting and had started being true. A wound you feel is a wound that's alive. A wound you've stopped feeling is a wound that's become the body. She straightened. She resumed walking. She came around the bend and saw him on the wall, and her face adjusted, not dramatically, not with performance, but with the small, practiced recalibration of a woman switching from private to public. The mask went on. The directness returned. Her eyes steadied. "You're early," she said. "I am. Did you—" "Yes." She stopped. The mask flickered. For a moment, 1 second, maybe less, the face behind it was visible. Not the analytical face, not the direct face, not the composed face. The face of a woman who had been caught in the most private moment she had, doing the thing she did every morning that no one was supposed to hear. How much? All three. She sat on the wall, not beside him, farther away than usual, the distance of a person who has been seen and is deciding whether to flee. Henry stayed where he was. He stayed quiet. He sat with the wall and the wind and the knowledge of what he had heard, and he let the silence do what silence does when it is honest, which is to hold space without filling it. A full minute passed. A kestrel hung above the ridge, riding the updraft, watching the ground below with the patient, focused attention of a predator who has all the time in the world. "I have said that every morning for 3 years," Judith said finally. Her voice was steady. She was not performing steadiness. She had simply defaulted to it, the resting state of a woman who has held herself together so long the holding has become automatic. "I know," Henry said. "You don't know." "I know because I say something similar, not the same words, but the same function. Every morning in the walled garden I look at the roses my wife planted, and I tell myself that no one could be her, and that looking for anyone is disloyalty, and that the empty house is the correct house because at least the empty house doesn't pretend to be something it isn't." Judith turned to look at him. The green eyes, his darker, hers lighter, both carrying the same weight. "That is the same," she said. "I know. We are both maintaining prisons and calling them devotion." "My sister said something similar. She used the word fool." "Your sister sounds useful." "She is. I ignore her." Judith almost smiled. The jaw she held so carefully relaxed for half a second before she caught it. "The woman in the portrait," she said. "Eleanor. She was good and kind and beautiful, and I spent 11 years measuring myself against her, and I will never be her." "That is true. I will never be Eleanor Holt. And my wife was direct and brave, and she said what she thought, and I spent 4 years locking myself in a house with her roses, and I will never find another Marguerite. That is also true. So what do we do with true things that are also cages?" Henry studied her face, the jaw, the hair escaping, the eyes that held the same grief his held, shaped differently, carried differently, but made from the same material. He did not say what he wanted to say. The words were not ready. Something in him was expanding, but whatever it was hadn't found a way out. Not yet. "We could start by walking at the same time on purpose," he said, "instead of pretending the fog arranges it." Judith looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Thursday. I also walk on Thursdays." "I didn't know that." "You do now." She stood. She walked east. He walked west. The kestrel dropped. A sudden vertical plunge, silent, decisive, and came up with something small and alive in its talons. If you have been listening since the beginning, if you are still here with Judith and Henry and the kestrel and the words she says every morning, thank you. You stayed. The next part of this story is for you. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment. Another tale awaits, but this one isn't finished, not even close. Now, back to the ridge. Mrs. Beale noticed the change, not because Judith told her. Judith told Mrs. Beale nothing, but because Judith began returning from her walks with color in her face that wasn't from the wind. Mrs. Beale had run the boarding house for 20 years and had seen more of human nature through her front window than most philosophers encounter in a library. She said nothing for 3 weeks. Then, on a Thursday evening, setting the soup tureen on the table, "The walks are agreeing with you, Miss Vane. The air is good. It is remarkable how the air improves on Tuesdays and Thursdays specifically." Judith looked at her. Mrs. Beale ladled the soup. It was better soup than usual, thicker, with actual meat in it. Mrs. Beale had been improving the soup on Tuesdays and Thursdays for weeks, and Judith had not noticed until this moment. She felt something close in her chest. Not warmth, suspicion. The soup was pity. Mrs. Beale had noticed the walks and the color and the hair, and had drawn conclusions, and the improved soup was the boarding-house equivalent of a pat on the head, the landlady feeling sorry for the spinster who had developed a hopeless attachment to a man on a hill. Judith ate the soup. She did not say thank you. She went to her room and sat with the suspicion and the spotted mirror and the 3 sentences, and she was certain she was right about the soup, because Judith Vane was a woman who read people correctly, and Mrs. Beale was a woman offering pity. She was wrong. She would discover this 6 months later on her wedding day, when Mrs. Beale arrived with the best soup she had ever made and set the tureen on a garden table and said, "About time," with the voice of a woman who had been rooting for someone all along and had expressed it the only way she knew how, with better ingredients on the days that mattered. But that is later. On this Thursday evening Judith ate the soup and was wrong about the woman who made it, and the wrongness sat in her like a stone she did not know she was carrying. On a Tuesday in late May it rained, not the polite English rain that mists and suggests, the kind that falls in sheets, that turns the path to mud, that comes at you sideways off the channel and hits the ridge like a punishment for being outdoors. Judith was on the wall when it started. Henry was beside her. Neither suggested leaving. They sat in the rain and argued about Wordsworth. Judith maintained that Wordsworth was a better poet than Coleridge. Henry maintained that Coleridge was more interesting, which was not the same as better, and that interesting was worth more. "Interesting is what you say about a person you cannot defend," Judith said. The rain was running down her nose. Her hair had come entirely undone. Not the gradual loosening of pins, but a full surrender, the knot giving up in a single wet collapse. Her dress was soaked through. "Coleridge wrote Kubla Khan in an opium dream," Henry said. "Wordsworth wrote about daffodils while walking. The imagination required is not comparable. The daffodils are better. The daffodils are honest. The opium palace is spectacle. You prefer honesty to spectacle. I have always preferred honesty to spectacle. Spectacle requires an audience. Honesty requires only a mirror." She heard what she had said. The mirror again. She stopped. They sat in the rain. Henry's left boot filled with water. When they stood, it squelched. "Your boots are ruined," she said. "They were already ruined." Neither of them meant the boots. The woman who did say something was Constance. Judith's sister visited in June. She came by coach from Devon, 2 daughters, Thomas, 2 trunks, and the energy of a woman who has temporarily escaped her domestic life and intends to make the most of it. The youngest, Thomas, aged 5, was carrying a jar containing a frog he had named Bishop, and which he refused to leave in Devon on the grounds that Bishop would miss him. The frog had no opinion on the matter, but they had survived the coach journey, which was more than could be said for Constance's nerves. Constance was 40, still golden-haired, though the gold was fading toward something paler. Still pretty, though the prettiness had softened into the pleasant, comfortable face of a woman who had spent 20 years being a clergyman's wife and a mother, and who had no complaints about it and no curiosity about what else she might have been. She was also, beneath the pleasantness, sharper than most people gave her credit for. She had inherited their father's solicitor's eye for evidence. She simply applied it to people instead of contracts. She noticed the walks. She noticed the color. She noticed that Judith, who had been steadily graying since leaving Hartfield, had started pinning her hair with more care on Tuesdays and Thursdays. On the 3rd day of her visit, sitting in Judith's small room at Mrs. Beale's, drinking tea from mismatched cups, Constance said, "Who is he?" "Who is who?" "Judith, you have pinned your hair differently on 2 of the 3 mornings I've been here. You pin it the same way every other day. You are not a woman who changes her hair for weather. Who is he?" Judith looked at her sister. She had spent 37 years being the clever one while Constance was the pretty one, and she had underestimated Constance for exactly as long, and she was still doing it, and Constance was still catching her. "A man I walk with, on the ridge." "A man you walk with." "We sit on a wall, we talk. He manages land somewhere nearby." "And?" "And nothing. We talk. He goes west. I go east." Constance set down her teacup with the careful precision of a woman who is about to say something her sister does not want to hear. "I have listened to you describe yourself as too old, too plain, and not enough for as long as I can remember. You said it when you were 25. You said it at Christmas, when you sat in my parlor comparing yourself to Eleanor Holt. A dead woman, Judith, a portrait. You turned a painting into a measuring stick, and you have been failing to measure up against oil and canvas for 11 years. Constance, and honestly, I think part of you wants to keep failing. I think the 3 sentences are comfortable. I think you—" She stopped. Her face changed. The bright certainty wavered. "No? That was unkind. I'm sorry, that's not— I don't think you want to suffer. I think suffering is familiar, and familiar feels safer than whatever this man on the wall is offering, and I understand that because I am your sister, and I know what our father's death did to you, and what Edward's house did to you, and what standing in front of that portrait every day for 11 years did to your idea of what you deserve." She picked up her teacup, put it down again. Her hands were not steady. "I'm too old." "You are 37. That is not old. That is the age at which a woman finally knows what she wants. I'm too plain. You have our father's face and our mother's eyes and a nose you broke falling out of a tree because you climbed higher than any boy in Taunton. That is not plain. That is a face that happened to a life." She paused, lost the rhythm, found it. "I'm not her." "You were never supposed to be her. Eleanor is dead. This man's wife, whoever she was, is gone. You are here. You are alive. And you are sitting on a wall twice a week with a man who makes you pin your hair differently, and you are telling me it is nothing." Judith stared at her sister. She stared at the golden hair fading to silver, and the pleasant face that held, beneath the pleasantness, the same vain stubbornness that Judith carried in a different shape. "How do you know his wife's name was Marguerite?" she asked. "You said manages land somewhere nearby. The only estate near Langford is Ashgrove. The Duke of Ashgrove's wife was Marguerite Calder. She died 4 years ago. The Duke has not been seen in high society since. Constance picked up her teacup. I am a clergyman's wife, Judith. I know every family in every parish within 50 miles. It is the one professional skill the position requires. Judith felt the floor tilt. Not visibly, the room stayed where it was. But the internal structure, the scaffolding she had built to contain what the Tuesdays and Thursdays were, shifted. He's a duke. He is. He didn't tell me. No, he told you his name was Henry, which is his name. The rest is what the world calls him. And the fact that he gave you the name instead of the title tells you more about what you are to him than anything I could say. Judith sat with this. She sat with the spotted mirror across the room, and the morning sentences, and the 3 years of erosion, and the fact that the man on the wall, the man with the laugh she had surprised out of him, was the Duke of Ashgrove. 35,000 a year. A Palladian house she could see from the ridge. A dead wife, whose roses he still tended. And she felt the 3 sentences tighten. Not loosen, tighten. Because a duke and a boarding-house spinster who mended clothes for a living was not a story the world would tell gently. The world would say what the mirror said, only louder. Too old, too plain, not her. I can't, she said. You can. You are choosing not to, and you are disguising the choice as math. The numbers are real. I am a governess who takes in mending. He is a duke. The arithmetic is a wall, and you are the one who built it. Constance left on Friday. She kissed Judith at the coach, while Thomas held Bishop the Frog against the window, and the other children fought over the last of Mrs. Beale's biscuits. At the door of the coach, Constance turned. Pin your hair on Tuesday. Go home, Constance. I will. And Judith. She paused. The sentence trailed off. She climbed into the coach and closed the door, and whatever she had been about to say stayed in the air between them, unfinished, the way the important things between sisters often stay. Tuesday, the ridge, the wall. Judith did not pin her hair differently. She pinned it the same way she always did, the plain knot, the practical arrangement. She was not going to perform. She was not going to pretend that knowing he was a duke changed nothing. It changed everything. The arithmetic changed. The 3-foot gap on the wall changed. The 3 sentences changed, because I'm not her was no longer just about Eleanor. It was about every woman a duke could have, every woman the world would consider appropriate, every woman who was younger and prettier and not living above a boarding house mending other people's hems. Henry was on the wall when she arrived. He saw her face. He saw the change. Not in the hair, not in the clothes, in the set of her jaw, the distance in her face, the rigidity of a woman who has received information and is processing it through the part of her mind that turns everything into reasons to leave. You know, he said, my sister told me. She is a clergyman's wife. She knows every duke within 50 miles. I should have told you. Yes. I didn't tell you because on this wall I am not a duke. I am a man who walks slowly and sits on stone and talks to a woman who outstrides him every morning. And if I had said, I am the Duke of Ashgrove on the first morning, you would have adjusted, you would have deferred, you would have become the version of yourself that the world requires in the presence of a title, and I would have lost the only person who talks to me as though I am a person. That is a reasonable explanation. But you still should have told me, because the woman you are talking to, the one who doesn't defer, she makes her decisions based on the information available. And you withheld information. And I have spent 11 years in a house where information was managed by people who thought they knew better than me. What I could handle. I will not live inside that again. Henry received this. He did not argue. He sat on the wall and he heard her, and his eyes, the ones women at balls had called mesmerizing, held something that no ball had ever produced, the expression of a man who has been told a true thing and is not defending against it. "You're right," he said. "I know. I am sorry. I know that too. What do you want me to do?" "I want you to be Henry on this wall and the Duke of Ashgrove everywhere else, and I want to know which one I am talking to at all times. I will not be managed, not by a duke, not by anyone." "You are talking to Henry. You have always been talking to Henry." Then Henry should have mentioned that he lives in the large house in the valley and has 35,000 a year and a seat in the House of Lords. 37,000. The harvest was good last year. She looked at him. He looked at her, and the rigidity cracked, not between them, but inside it. The jaw loosened. Her expression shifted. The corner of her mouth moved. She almost laughed. The machinery attempted it, and Henry saw the attempt, and he knew that the attempt was worth more than the laugh, because the attempt meant she was choosing to stay on the wall. "Thursday?" he said. "Thursday, and you're telling me everything. Income, estates, how many servants, and whether you actually manage the land yourself or just talk about it impressively." "I manage it myself. We'll see." She came to Ashgrove on a Saturday in July. Not to the wall, to the house. Henry had invited her to see the walled garden. The invitation was genuine. The garden was the one thing at Ashgrove he was proud of, and showing it to Judith was the most vulnerable thing he had done in 4 years. It was also, by the standards of 1849 propriety, reckless. A single woman visiting a widowed duke's estate, unchaperoned, would generate exactly the kind of gossip that destroyed reputations. Judith knew this. She went anyway. Her reputation in Langford was already the reputation of a spinster who took in mending and walked alone on hills at dawn. There was nothing left to protect that she valued more than the garden she had been invited to see, because the walled garden was Marguerite's, and bringing Judith into it was acknowledging that something he had sealed shut was beginning to open. Judith walked through the gate and stopped. The garden was beautiful. Not the manicured, designed beauty of an estate garden managed by staff, the slightly wild, deeply personal beauty of a space that had been tended by someone who loved it. Roses climbing the south wall, lavender along the paths, a fig tree in the corner that had no business surviving in Somerset and was surviving anyway because someone had built a shelter around it and refused to give up. "She planted this," Judith said. Not a question. "Most of it. The fig was mine. She said it would die. It didn't." Judith walked the paths. She touched the lavender. She bent to smell a rose, a pink climbing rose on the south wall, full-blown, fragrant, alive with bees. She straightened, and her face held something she had not shown him before. Not admiration, not sadness. Recognition. The recognition of a woman who has lived inside a memorial and is now standing inside a garden, and the difference between the two is that the garden is still growing. "She was good at this," Judith said. "She was good at most things." "I know. I have been measuring myself against women like her my entire life. First Eleanor, now Marguerite. And the measurement always comes out the same." She turned to face him, both of them standing in his dead wife's garden, surrounded by roses his dead wife had planted, in the house his dead wife had made into a home. "I am too old for you," she said. "I am 37. Your wife was 19 when you married her. I am not 19. I am not going to become 19. I don't want 19. I am plain. You can see that. Everyone can see that. Your wife was— I've seen the portrait in the village church. She was beautiful." She was. And I am not her. I will never be Marguerite. I cannot be direct in the way she was. I am direct in my own way, which is colder and harder and less charming, and I say things like, the arithmetic doesn't balance, when what I mean is, I am afraid. She stood in the garden. The rose petals shifted in the breeze. A bee investigated her sleeve and decided she was not a flower and moved on. I say these three things every morning, she said, in a mirror with a hole in the silver. Too old, too plain, not her. I have said them for 3 years. Before that, I said them about Eleanor for 11 years. And before that, I said them about my sister for 25 years. The words change. The woman I'm not changes. The measurement doesn't. She held his gaze. Her eyes were bright, not with tears, but with the effort of saying something she had never said to another person. The morning recitation, delivered not to a mirror, but to a man standing in his dead wife's roses. That is who I am, she said, a woman who inventories her deficiencies every morning before breakfast. And I am telling you this because you deserve to know what you are looking at. Henry stood in the garden. He stood among the roses Marguerite had planted, the lavender she had chosen, the fig tree she had said would die, and that he had kept alive because keeping things alive was the only form of love he had left. He looked at Judith, at the face he had been watching for months, the jaw, the hair half down, the eyes that held intelligence and fear, and the courage of a woman who has just handed someone the weapon that could destroy her and is waiting to see if they use it. He looked at her, the way he had looked at the fig tree on the morning it produced its first fruit, with the stunned, grateful disbelief of a man who had been told something couldn't survive and was watching it survive anyway. "Good," he said, one word, the word the title promised. Judith stared at him. "Good," he said again. "You are not Marguerite. Good. I loved Marguerite. I will love her until— that is not going to change. But I don't need another—" He stopped. The sentence had collapsed. He was a man who had barely spoken to anyone for 4 years, and he was trying to say the most important thing he had ever said, and the words were not cooperating. He tried again. "You are not too old. You are 37, and you have more energy at 6 in the morning than I have at noon, and I'm losing this. The point is your hair, the gray in your hair. It is evidence of a life that demanded more than most lives demand." He stepped toward her. 1 step. The distance closed from 5 feet to 3. "You are not too plain. You have a face I think about every day. The nose, the freckles, the way your jaw sets when you've decided something. I think about your face because it is the most honest face I have ever seen, and honesty lasts longer than—" He stopped again. He pressed his hand against his forehead, a man fighting his own silence for every word. "I had this prepared. On the walk here, I had the sentences in order. They were good sentences. They are gone." Another step. 3 feet to 2. "What I am trying to say, what the sentences were supposed to say, is that I have been in this garden for 4 years maintaining roses for a woman who cannot smell them, and you are the first person who has made me want to walk through the gate, and you are not her. And that is the whole point. Good. You are not her. I don't want her. I want the woman who walks in fog and told me I should have mentioned the 35,000 and split an apple with me on a wall and—" He ran out. The words stopped. He stood in the garden, with his hands at his sides, and the expression of a man who has tried to say something enormous and has managed approximately 60% of it and does not know if 60% is enough. "I am doing this badly," he said. "Yes," Judith said. "You are." She stepped forward. 1 step, 2 feet to 1. "Say it again," she said. "Which part?" "The first word." "Good." "Again." "Good. You are not her." "Good." She put her hand on his chest. Not his face, not his arm, his chest. Over the place where Marguerite still lived, where 4 years of grief and maintained roses had built something so solid he had believed nothing could open it. "I am going to say something," she said, "and I need you to hear it without fixing it." "All right." "I am terrified. I am standing in your dead wife's garden with my hand on your chest, and I am terrified because the last time I loved someone, he died saying another woman's name, and I held his hand while it went cold, and I cried alone in a room at the top of a house, and nobody knew because nobody thought to ask whether the governess had feelings. And I packed a trunk, and I moved to a boarding house, and I stood in front of a mirror every morning, and I told myself I was not enough, because the alternative was to believe I was enough, and that the world simply didn't care, and that possibility was worse." Her hand was on his chest. His heart was beating against her palm. She could feel it, faster than a resting heart, the rhythm of a man whose body was responding to something his mind had not yet caught up with. "I cannot be Marguerite," she said. "I will not try. I will not wear her dresses or copy her manners, or learn to say what I think in the direct, charming way she apparently said it. I will say what I think in my own way, which is cold and precise and sometimes unkind, and I will keep your accounts better than any steward you've ever employed, and I will walk your ridge every morning faster than you can keep. Up! And I will probably never stop saying the 3 sentences in the mirror, because the mirror has been my companion longer than anyone, and habits are the last thing to die. You could say different sentences, such as, I'm here, I'm enough, I'm mine. Judith looked at him. The green eyes, his dark, hers light, held each other in the July garden with the roses breathing around them, and the fig tree standing in its corner, alive, fruiting, refusing to die in a climate that should have killed it. "That is a terrible replacement prayer," she said. "It is. But it has the advantage of being true." She did not kiss him. He did not kiss her. They stood with her hand on his chest and his heart under her palm and the roses all around them, and the moment held them the way the ridge held the kestrel, in the air, balanced between one thing and the next. "I would like to walk tomorrow," she said. "Not Tuesday. Tomorrow. Tomorrow. And I would like you to tell me about Marguerite, not the version you maintain, the real one, the one who argued with you and was impatient and said the fig would die. She said it would freeze in the first winter and that I was sentimental. Was she right? About the sentiment, not about the fig." Judith almost smiled. The corner of her mouth gave, then pulled back, the half-surrender of a woman who is not ready to concede, but whose face has stopped listening to her. "Tomorrow," she said, 6 o'clock, bring better shoes, I walk fast." Epilogue. They married in October, not in the village church, in the walled garden. Judith's choice. Henry had obtained a special license from the Archbishop of Canterbury, quietly, efficiently, the way he handled everything that required the machinery of his title. The license cost money and required connections that only a duke possessed. It was, Judith noted, the first time his rank had been useful to her, rather than an obstacle between them. The marriage itself was, by the standards of the English peerage, a scandal of precisely the kind that generated 6 months of drawing-room conversation and then evaporated. A duke, any duke, marrying a penniless, aging, untitled former governess was an affront to every family with a marriageable daughter and a strategic eye on the Ashgrove fortune. Lady Fenton had received 11 letters from concerned acquaintances in the 3 weeks between the announcement and the wedding. She had replied to none of them, She had, however, shown them to Henry, who read the first two, set down the stack, and said, "The 12th will probably be from the Archbishop." He was surprisingly polite about the license. They married privately because the world's opinion had been the problem from the beginning, and they were not going to invite it to the wedding. "If we are going to begin," she said, "we are going to begin where she is. Not around her, not despite her, with her." The vicar performed the ceremony, beside the rose that Marguerite had planted on the south wall. Constance attended with her clergyman, her 2 daughters, and Thomas, who were threatening to pick the figs. Lady Fenton attended with the expression of a woman who has been vindicated so thoroughly that graciousness is the only appropriate response. Caroline sent a letter. She could not attend. Her guardian's wife was ill, and the household needed her, which was, Judith reflected, exactly the kind of invisible obligation that defined a young woman's life in a house that was not her own. But the letter said, "I did not know what you were to me until you left. I know now. I wish you every happiness, and I wish it had been possible for you to be happy while you were with us, but I think perhaps we did not make that easy, and I am sorry." Judith read the letter in the garden before the ceremony. She folded it and put it in the pocket of her dress, and she carried it against her thigh during the vows, the way she carried everything that mattered, privately, precisely, close to the body. "I told you," she said to Henry. "You told me. I told you years ago." "You did. The word I used was fool. I recall. I was right." "You were right." Mrs. Beale attended. She brought soup, her best soup, not the watery Tuesday soup, the real soup. She set the tureen on the garden table and looked at Judith with the round pink face and the flower-dusted apron and the expression of a woman who had been rooting for someone all along and had expressed it the only way she knew how. "About time," she said. Judith, who had spent 6 months believing the soup was pity, stood in the walled garden and understood that she had been wrong about Mrs. Beale the way she had been wrong about very few people, completely, stubbornly, in a way that revealed more about her own assumptions than about the woman she had misjudged. The soup had never been pity. It had been hope. And hope served in a tureen on Tuesdays. And Thursdays, without explanation or expectation, was the kindest thing anyone had done for her since the floor beside Caroline's bed. Judith wore green, not white, not cream. The mossy, quiet green of her eyes, of the ridge in spring, of the Somerset hills she had walked every morning for 3 years, while telling herself she was not enough. Constance made the dress. It had pockets, because Constance had learned from visiting that Judith put her hands in her pockets when she was thinking, and a dress without pockets was a dress that fought its wearer. She walked to the ceremony alone, on no one's arm. Judith Vane had never belonged to anyone who had the right to give her, and she was not going to invent the tradition now. She walked through the walled garden, past the lavender, past the fig tree, past the roses. She walked to the south wall where Henry stood in a dark blue coat with his black hair and his white streak, and his eyes that were, for the first time in 4 years, looking at something in this garden that was alive. "You walked fast," he said. "You're lucky I slowed down." The vicar cleared his throat. The ceremony was brief. The vows were not. Henry's vow. "I vow to say your name, not hers, when I am thinking of you. I vow to walk at your pace, which is faster than mine, and to keep up or be, what is the word, left behind, which is what I deserve if I fall behind." He paused, looked at the roses, looked back. "I vow to tell you the truth, including the 37,000, and to never again withhold information on the grounds that I know better than you what you can handle." He paused again. Longer than he meant to. The vicar shifted. Constance's youngest, dropped a fig on the path, and Constance stopped it with her boot. "I vow to tend this garden with you, not for her, with you, and to let the roses be roses instead of what they have been." He paused, lost the next line, found it. "I vow to say good every morning, as many times as you need, until the mirror stops being the loudest voice in the room." Judith's vow. "I vow to stop saying the 3 sentences." She stopped. "That is probably not true. I will probably say them tomorrow. But I vow to try to say different ones. Eventually, with practice," she took a breath, "I vow to walk your ridge and sit on your wall and argue with you about novels and drainage and whether the kestrel is the same kestrel. I vow to keep your accounts and correct your steward and be cold and precise and occasionally unkind, because that is who I am, and you said good, and I am holding you to it." She paused. The freckles, her eyes bright with something she had not allowed herself to feel in front of other people since she was 25. "I vow to be here, not her, not anyone else, here," Constance cried. Lady Fenton did not cry, but produced a handkerchief anyway, because a woman who has been right deserves a prop. The vicar pronounced, "Them married. The children ate the figs. Mrs. Beale served the soup. And in the corner of the walled garden, the fig tree, the tree Marguerite had said would die, the tree Henry had kept alive for 20 years, through shelter and stubbornness, the tree that had no business surviving in Somerset, held its fruit in the October light. It had never produced more than it produced that year. On a morning in December, Judith stood in front of a new mirror, not the spotted glass with the hole in the silver, a proper mirror, full length, in the bedroom she shared with Henry at Ashgrove House. She looked at herself. 37, freckled, crooked nose, brown hair, green eyes. The 3 sentences rose. They always rose. They were old tenants, and they did not vacate easily. She opened her mouth. "I'm here," she said. "I'm enough. I'm mine." It sounded wrong, too clean, too much like a corrective exercise prescribed by someone who had read a pamphlet about the benefits of positive thinking. She tried again. "I'm here. I'm enough. I'm—" "Ridiculous," Henry said from the bed, where he was reading with his glasses on his nose and his hair standing at angles that no duke should permit. "You are ridiculous, and you are talking to a mirror, and the mirror cannot hear you. And I can, and I would like to inform you that the woman in the mirror is extraordinary, and the man in the bed would appreciate it if she stopped arguing with the glass and came back to the argument we were having about the kestrel." "We were not having an argument." "We were. You said it was the same kestrel. I said it was a different one. The argument is unresolved. It requires your attention. The mirror does not." Judith looked at the mirror. She looked at Henry. She looked at the woman in the glass, the woman who had been too old, too plain, not her, for 15 years, and who was standing in a duke's bedroom in December being told to stop talking to herself and come argue about a bird. She turned away from the mirror. She went back to the argument. The 3 sentences would come again. Tomorrow, probably, and the day after. They were old. They were deep. They would not disappear because a man said good or because a vow was made in a garden beside a dead woman's roses. But they were quieter now. And the voice that answered them, the voice that said, "Here, enough, mine," was getting louder. And that is the story of the woman who said she was too old, too plain, and not her, every morning for 15 years, and the man who heard it once and said the only word that mattered. Good. Thank you for being here tonight. Every listen, every comment, every subscription builds this place. And this place is for the women who have stood in front of mirrors and said the worst things about themselves and believed every word. If this stayed with you, tell me where it landed. Was it the 3 sentences in the spotted mirror? The fog on the ridge? The sheep that coughed? The sister who noticed the hairpins? The walled garden and the roses? The fig tree that should have died? The word good, said once, in a garden by a man who meant it? Or was it the morning in December when she turned away from the mirror and went back to the argument about the kestrel? Drop it below. I read every one. And if you haven't subscribed, the next story is already growing. In damaged ground, where the experts said nothing could survive. Until next time, take care of yourselves. And remember, the 3 worst sentences you say about yourself are not facts, they are habits. And habits, given time and stubbornness and someone who says good, can be broken. Good night. I'll see you in the next one.